has said that she has a continuing love relationship with a being now coming up out of the and with no clothes on.
I am so excited to introduce our guest today, Barbara Lamb. Barbara is an icon and a pioneer in the UFO community. In addition to being a UFO and crop circle researcher, Barbara is a world-class hypnotherapist who has regressed thousands of people to recover their ET memories and past lives since she began this work in 1984. Barbara has been featured as an expert guest on many television shows and many movies, as well as on Gaia Television and many different conferences. If that isn't enough, because there's more, Barbara has also authored several books: Crop Circles Revealed, Alien Experiences, Meet the Hybrids, Kids' Adventures with ET Friends in Space, and her most recent book, which is just coming out shortly, is called Cosmic Convergence. So we are very excited to talk with her today about this and many other subjects. So welcome, Barbara. We are so happy to have you join us, and a big congratulations on the new book coming out.
Thank you. Very nice to be with you.
We're happy to have you. I have had actually the distinct honor of meeting you in person. You have just such a tremendous amount of experience to share. But if we can just first start with asking you to share with us a little bit about how you first got started with hypnosis. And also, when did it take that turn away from the traditional form into a little more of an unusual direction?
It certainly did do that. Yes, indeed. Well, I began way back in 1976, becoming licensed as a psychotherapist and did a regular psychotherapy practice up until I moved from one location to another in 2017. I was in the early years of my psychotherapy practice. I noticed that I was on occasion doing what I called deeper work. And that is, I would get a person into a nice state of deep relaxation. And then we would work from there with whatever was needed to be done for that particular client. And somebody pointed out that I was very good at hypnosis. And I said, oh, well, I'm not doing hypnosis. I didn't think I was. But actually, it turns out that I was doing that, because hypnosis is just a nice state of deep relaxation when you're focused on a particular aspect that you would like to improve or work on or develop. So then I began to take a couple of hypnosis training courses. And in 1984, I began my training as a past life regression therapist. I did that training for 5 years. And then, now, during all of those years, I did not know anything about extraterrestrial beings or UFOs or anything of that sort. But it was coming up in some of the regressions with some of my regular counseling clients that 3 of them actually, in their regressions, found that they themselves were extraterrestrial beings who had come to planet Earth, each one for a different reason. And I thought, wow, that's amazing, because I've never heard of anything like that. And then in my last module of training for past life regression therapy, the trainer mentioned that it could happen sometime to those of us being trained that somebody would come to us with the complaint that they had been visited by very unusual beings who were not human and even taken away, and that a lot of them would be confused about that or even traumatized. So we just needed to know that it could happen, that in doing regression therapy, that somebody would find us for that particular reason. Well, I had never heard of that before. At that point, this was 1988. And I just thought, wow. And then, even more surprising, there was a very loud voice in my head, and it was not my voice. And it said, pay attention to this, Barbara. You will be doing this. Whoa, what is that? So here I was introduced to a whole new idea that there are other beings of some sort from somewhere other than Earth, coming to people and taking them away, doing heaven knows what. And that was a new one. I was startled. And then this insistent voice in my head. I still don't know who that was. It must have been one of my guides, I would think. And I found that after that, when I was out doing errands, it was almost as if my car insisted on going to a bookstore or a magazine store. And I realized that I was looking for information that there might be, hopefully, about UFOs and the beings on those UFOs, the extraterrestrials. And so that went on for a few years, well, 3 years really, uh, researching as much as I could at that time. There wasn't a lot available about that at that time. And then I happened to hear a couple of lectures involving this subject of different beings from other planets visiting Earth and taking some people, definitely not all. And they were called abductions, I realized. And I became more and more interested. And then in 1991, my first client, a young woman, came to me for regression work because she was having those kinds of experiences with very, very unusual beings who were totally, apparently not human, and she was actually traumatized by it. Poor dear, very nice young woman, and we did 6 regression on 6 separate sessions, and each one of those regressions was to a separate experience with some of these beings, and then she came in for a 7th session and said, "Oh, I am just so okay with all this now. In fact, I'm very pleased. And my boyfriend and I are going to move out into the country in a little cottage by ourselves." And I said, "Yeah, well, you've been visited a lot, right? Living in a suburban town. So you're probably going to be visited even more out in the country." And she said, "Yes, I know. And we're okay with that." So that made me realize that, wow, this work can be really significant and very helpful for somebody who's been having those kinds of contacts and encounters. So then I felt open to receiving more if anybody else would ever come. I didn't know anybody would. But a few months later, another lady came to me for regression work, and she was experiencing these extraterrestrial contacts. So we had a few different sessions to her experiences, and she felt so much better after that. And then another and another and another. And now it's been, oh gosh, 3,500 or maybe even 4,000 people now whom I have regressed simply to extraterrestrial encounters that they have had. And some people, especially in the 1990s, my first decade of doing this kind of work, some of them were able to come to me in person for regressions. Oh, sometimes 8 times or 10 times, 12, or even more. One lady came for 20 separate regressions. Another lady came for almost 60 regressions and over a period of 10 or 11 years. So that was extremely rich and rewarding to see the variety of beings who can visit one human and the variety of agendas that these different species of beings have. And I have just learned so much in doing this work, which the people who've come for the work say is extremely helpful. I think it's important to realize that it seems, as far as I know, that most people who are having extraterrestrial contacts are just remembering a very few moments of those experiences. And like, for instance, they might be sleeping at night and they might wake up and have a sense of presence. That is a sense of somebody there. And they know it doesn't make any sense for somebody to be there. But if they open their eyes and look around, they will very often, if they're having these contacts, they will very often see that there is one being or 2 or 3 or more, or sometimes a whole group of unusual looking beings in the room, sometimes right around the beds, or they'll wake up and they'll see little lights flying around in the room that they can't explain, or they'll see a beam of light coming through the window from up in the sky. Then they might be aware of beings in the room. So that is how these experiences often start. Although They can happen just about anywhere. A person might be driving along. This is very common. A person is driving along daytime or nighttime, and they have awareness, especially if it's at night, that there's light shining on their car, sometimes from above. But the people who are visited in their bedrooms at night or visited any place until it's later, like maybe a couple of hours later, and they wake up again in bed. Or in some cases, they wake up in a different part of their home. They're returned slightly incorrectly. Sometimes they're even returned outside of their house. And I personally know people who've had that happen. And it's very mysterious because the house alarm is on and they can't get back in the house because they don't have a key. I do know of a man, I personally know him, in England who was taken from his home, but he was returned to another home, to the basement of the home of a good friend of his with whom
Oh,
he
that's
had
funny.
that evening. Yes, and he was returned without any clothes on, and so he found himself
That's
in the
embarrassing.
basement.
Yikes.
The basement of his friend's home. He'd been to that basement. It was sort of a recreation room type of basement, and then he climbed up uh, the basement steps, the stairway, and which opened up into a kitchen, and there was his friend's mother, astonished to
Whoopsie.
see him coming up out of the and with no clothes on.
That's a tough
he, was,
one to explain.
he was a teenager at that point. Yeah, that was a tough one. But usually the person is returned to wherever it is that they're taken from. And also, a person can be taken in a car, and the whole car with the person in it is taken up onto the ship. And then activities happen with the person. The person is put back in the car, and the car is put back on the road. So I know people who have been going in one direction on a freeway in California, and then suddenly they're about 20 miles ahead of where they last had any memory of being in the car. And I know a couple who were driving in one direction on another California freeway, and they were gone for a couple of hours. They were late to the event that they'd been heading toward, and they realized too that when suddenly they were in the car and it was driving in the opposite direction. So they've been put back on the same freeway, but in the wrong direction. So things like that can happen. And people can also have these contacts and visits, even when the person is in a whole group of people, like a party or a meeting or an insurance office with one of the people I worked with, even right in the middle of the day, right in the middle of all kinds of people, that one person is visited. And when that one person is visited, it seems like all the other people in that area, in that gathering, are what we call switched off. That means they're just made to be totally out of consciousness. So if they're at a party, as with one situation I worked with, whoever was smoking a cigarette, when these beings came in, the person was just sort of frozen with the cigarette between the fingers on the way up to the mouth. And the same with a drink, a glass of beer at the party. It was just heading up toward the mouth, and then it just stopped for a couple of hours while the person was having her ET experience. And then when the beings brought this young woman back, deposited her there on the sofa in the party where she had been taken from, and then they left, the beings left, and then suddenly everybody kind of came to. Of course, the cigarette had burned down. The beer was still in the glass on the way up to the mouth, and people went on with their partying. But eventually somebody would say, gee, it's much later than I thought. Or the other say, how did it get to be midnight? I thought it was only about 10 o'clock. And everybody had been aware that there had been somehow a mysterious passage of time without realizing what had happened to the young woman, that she had been taken away by these beings. So the beings can do just astonishingly amazing things with people. For instance, when they come and take a person, they can float the person up from the bed if the person's been in a bed, and float across the room and through the wall, what we consider a solid wall, or through a closed window, or through a ceiling. And how they do this, I don't think any of us know, but it's reported so many times. and then they fly them out through space and into a craft, which we tend to call a UFO. And then various things go on. All kinds of different things happen in those encounters on the ships. Some of these things that happen seem to be more for the interest of the extraterrestrial beings. Many people are subjected to a medical type of examination on the ship, and they may feel like, oh, this is very invasive, or, I didn't give permission for this, I don't want this. But in many, many cases, it turns out that those medical procedures are done to really check on the body systems of us people who are taken. And if they detect something wrong in the physical body of the person, they will very often tell the person. For instance, they might say, we detect a problem with your spleen. When you get home, we suggest that you go to your own earth doctor and have him check your spleen because we detect a problem there, or whatever organ they have detected a physical problem. And with the cases that I know where that has happened, when the person has gone home and checked with their human medical doctor, they do find out that, yes, they really do have a problem with that part of their body. So that can be very, very useful. And then, even more remarkable, I think, is that after a physical examination, the beings will sometimes just simply go right ahead without even saying anything, just go right ahead and heal the person. There are many, many cases known about from me and other people doing this kind of work, cases where the person has been healed right then and there on that ship. Some of the things that they've been healed of have been really drastic, like real severe heart problems or other major organ problems, or even brain work. That's been done by several people whom I have regressed. So those physical examinations sometimes turn out to be really, really useful to the person. Although I think you can appreciate that when a person is asleep at night and these unusual beings come and float the person up out of bed and make it so that the person doesn't move, and that's so that the person can be moved through the wall and through the space easily without injury to the person or to the beings during the removal. Um, anyway, they're taken there, uh, and they have no idea. The person has no idea what's going to happen. So, of course, it tends to be very frightening, very worrisome, as you can imagine, particularly for a person lying there having a nice sleep, and then suddenly they're waking up and they can't move. They can only move their eyes. They see these unusual beings, lights, etc., in the room, and it's they feel powerless. Can't even call out to anybody else who might be sleeping in the room because anybody else in the room seems to be in an incredibly deep, deep sleep, which has been enabled by the beings. That's the switching off that I referred to before. Uh, so anyway, all kinds of things happen to people who experience these things. It's a huge range, and having done so many regressions, now I just feel like, whoa, there's a tremendous panorama of beings and of things that they do with people. So basically, these extraterrestrial beings seem to be very, very interested in humanity and interested in how we think, interested in how we feel, the emotions that we have, that many of the species out there in space don't have. They might have enormous technological skills and wonderful thinking in that particular way, but they don't. Most of them seem to not have either any or much emotion. And it's one of the reasons why they're very interested in us humans, because they know that we have the full gamut of emotions. Probably a lot of our emotions, they can't even imagine what it would be like to feel those things. And some of the beings actually have expressed that they miss that they would like to have some emotion.
Yeah.
It gives life so much more interest in color and zip and zing.
Zip and zing, I love that. Do you have your own personal experience with extraterrestrials?
Yes, I've had 4
Really?
experiences, and I would like to say straight away that I am not a typical experiencer, although I am an experiencer of this phenomenon. But most people start having these experiences, if they're going to have them at all. Most people start having them very, very young in life, as children, as toddlers, even as newborn babies. And
Wow.
one man, I regress back in the 1990s many times, he began having his experiences when he was still in his mother's womb. When he was
Wow.
visited, yeah, he was visited by, that's the youngest I know of. He was probably about 6 months old in his mother's womb. And he was visited by a being. He couldn't see the being, but he could feel kind of a heat, a nice warmth, energy uh, coming to him in the womb from outside of his mother's abdomen. And he could hear the being, or he could pick it up telepathically, saying, I am here to help you because you have a problem. You have a very serious problem. You have a hole in your heart. And if you are born with that hole in your heart, you will not be able to live very long at all. So I am here to put an invisible electromagnetic strip over the hole in your heart, while you're still in the womb. And he was born at the appropriate time and lived and kept living because it seemed like every year or so, he would be visited and taken away by that same being, the very same one, the same individual being, who would remind him each time, remember, now I am refurbishing the invisible electromagnetic strip in your heart, because otherwise you'll be bleeding from your heart and you will not be able to continue to live. So that man grew up to be a big, strong, husky man, 6 foot tall, good build, very active, had very active work that he did for his living. And eventually, at age 48, he had uh, detected a heart problem, and he went in for heart surgery. And his wife happened to be a surgical nurse and got permission to be in the operating room when his surgery was going on. And so she heard the surgeon say, "Oh my goodness, this man has a hole in his heart the size of a silver dollar. I don't understand how he could be alive all this time." And he did regular surgery on that. But anyway, the extraterrestrials' work had gotten him to age 48, doing very, very well physically in his life. And then finally, humans had to come in and do the rest. But that was a wonderful thing for him. And like with many experiencers of this phenomenon, he had many different experiences with different kinds of beings. I mean, all kinds of beings over a period of decades. And in other words, it's not just the same one. And that seems to be typical of most of the people that I have worked with, that, over a period of time, they've had experiences with many different types of beings who have different agendas. And in some cases, the person seems to be aware of having one individual being that they continue to have contact with, even though on some occasions they have these other beings come to them too. But sometimes people have what they consider a lifelong guide or a lifelong mentor who is an extraterrestrial, and that probably a couple of times a year at least, they will be taken to that particular being. And in many cases, these people who experience this will channel a being like that, and which is wonderful because it brings more and more knowledge through to the rest of us humans. about the beings and their intentions with us and their hopes for us as a species on Earth. And we can learn more about them in that particular way if they're willing to give information about themselves. Some are more focused on giving us information about themselves. Some are more focused on the help that is needed here on Earth. And some are very busy coaching that human person into doing a particular kind of work here amongst humans, work that they would like to do, but they can't be here to do it. They wouldn't be able to survive our bacteria and viruses and density. A lot of them talk about the density here on Earth as compared to where they are. And so that brings us to the subject of walk-in people and hybrid people
From your
and
book?
starseeds. Yes, the book Cosmic Convergence is being published this month, hopefully April 2024, and will be out soon. And that is all about these three categories of people whom we call walk-ins, hybrids, and starseeds. So a lot of the people listening to this material right now could very well be a walk-in or a hybrid or a starseed, particularly a starseed. A starseed is a person, and fortunately we have many of them on the earth now, I think all over the earth, a person who is connected in a significant way with some of the other beings out there in space. And they're connected with very benevolent beings, and they want humans to know more and more about those benevolent beings. They also are people who seem to be dedicated to helping fellow humans, and in many cases, helping animals here on Earth with the blessings of those higher beings out there in space. Um, so a hybrid is doing the same kind of work, trying to raise the consciousness of humanity. And a difference there between starseeds and hybrids is that the hybrids actually have DNA from one species or two or three or four or five, depending on the person. Uh, but they are here doing the work that those benevolent extraterrestrials would very much like to see done on Earth that they can't do because of not being able to survive here. So they create these hybrid people who are mostly human in percentage and are raised in their mother's wombs full term and are born here and go through all the phases of life that their fellow babies go through, developing into toddlers and children and teenagers and adults, and get into their work. And they have different characteristics, these hybrids, from other people. Uh, some other people may have some of their skills, but usually not as many as the hybrids have. In other words, they have a full range of psychic skills, clairvoyance, clairsentience, and so forth, clairaudient. They can read people's minds. They have telepathic ability. They can know things at a distance, rather like remote viewing, but they're not trained in it. They just do it. Many of them can walk into a room and just know where somebody's having a headache or somebody's having a stomach ache or somebody's back is aching or whatever the physical infirmity is. They can just tune right into that. And significantly, they not only can tell what's going on in a person's body, but they can heal it. They all seem, the ones I know, all seem to have the ability to heal other people and heal animals, heal really any life form that would need refurbishing or restimulating or actually healing. Um, and they all have lots of visits with their extraterrestrial beings, the ones they have the genetics from. So different species of extraterrestrials work together. And as a collective group, they have decided to create a hybrid to sort of represent them and do the work that they would like to see done on Earth. There's also another category of hybrids which live totally on the ships. They are not born here as the ones I've been speaking about, but a very typical way for those hybrids who live on the ships to be created is that the extraterrestrial beings have taken eggs from a human woman and sperm from a human male that may be, in fact, usually would be the husband of the female, if that female has a husband. If not, the sperm is taken from another male here on Earth. And that's combined by the extraterrestrials and into creating an embryo. And in the embryo, they add the extraterrestrial genetics along with our human genetics. And then they take this little embryo and they implant that into the woman's uterus, usually the woman whose eggs had been taken for the making of this child. And they implant that little embryo in the woman, and she realizes that she's pregnant. And she goes to the doctor and has an ultrasound and all of that, and it's validated that yes, indeed, she's pregnant. Everybody is assuming it's fully human, of course. And then after about 2 months or so, usually before 3 months, the beings actually come again and take that little embryo from the woman. And the woman wakes up one morning and realizes, gee, I don't feel the same now. I did feel pregnant, but now I don't. And if she goes and gets that checked by a doctor, that will be validated that she was pregnant and she's not pregnant anymore. And the doctor will usually say, oh, when did you have your miscarriage? And she'll say, I never had a miscarriage. I would have noticed that. And he said, well, then when did you have your abortion? And she might say, well, I never had an abortion. I don't agree about having abortions. I never would do that. But where is this embryo? And the doctors will very often say, well, sometimes the embryo pulls away from the wall of the uterus and gets absorbed into the system. And so they just sort of leave it at that. But in the meantime, this embryo is being cared for on the ship with the beings. They put that embryo in a special tank of fluid, looks like water, but it's probably a more nourishing fluid, and gestated as if in a womb, but just floating in this water. And these tanks, I've seen people's drawings of them who have experienced them in regressions. And the tank is always combined to some sort of equipment by wires and a tube of some sort, probably monitoring the temperature and the chemical consistency of the fluid, I would imagine. And after another several months, when it looks like the baby is developed enough to be quote unquote born, the baby will be taken out of this tank and raised, wrapped up in swaddling clothes and raised on the ship along with many other babies. So these are hybrid babies, part human and part extraterrestrial because of the genetics that have been added. And those hybrids tend to live their whole lives on the ships or perhaps on another planet for some phases. And they assist, when they grow old enough, they assist the extraterrestrial beings in whatever is needed to be done on the ship. So many women who have had that happen have eventually had the occasion of being taken onto a ship and introduced to her hybrid children. So it might be as young as the baby being a newborn baby, and in which case she is asked to and give the baby love and nurturing, because they have recognized that their hybrid babies will not survive unless they have some human contact, and particularly loving, nurturing contact. So some people, many people I know, have been able to visit with their hybrid child, or maybe more than one child, over a period of time, a period of years during the growing up years of that hybrid child, and develop kind of a relationship with that child. Although the person usually isn't on the spaceship for hours, it's usually 1.5 or 2 hours. Well, as I said before, I'm not the typical experiencer of extraterrestrial contact, and I never had any experience that I am aware of. So it's helpful to say that you are aware of, because people might have recollection of one event, one visitation by these beings. But it turns out that they've had a whole lifetime of them without consciously knowing about it. So that's why I say that we know of, talking about these visitations. So as far as I know, I had nothing like this happen to me until 1994. Now, by that time, I was very involved, very enthusiastic about the crop circle phenomenon happening in England. I was going to England every summer to visit, study, experience the crop circles that were happening there. And so I had a client at that time, the one who came to me for about 11 years. She was also channeling an extraterrestrial being. And this was really thrilling for me because I kept having these conversations with him through my client. Sometimes she would come for a regression. Sometimes she'd come and we would just talk and she would do the channeling. So the entity who channeled through her knew that I was very involved in the crop circle phenomenon, very dedicated to going there in the summers and researching it as much as I could. And so he said in January of 1994, he said, Barbara, if you would like to, you could be taken for the making of a crop circle. And I said, wow, that would be really excited, but I'll have to think about that. I'm not, and I did think about it for about 6 months. And then the last channeling session before I went to England that summer, I told him, this extraterrestrial being, that I had decided I would like to be taken for the making of a crop circle. I didn't know what that would entail, but and that was part of the scary part of it. Just I don't know what to expect. But anyway, I thought, well, by that time, 1994, I had regressed so many people, and none of them had been harmed in any way, had not been endangered, had not been harmed. They might have been medically examined. I mean, they all had, but they were returned and they were fine. And so I felt safer about it. And I said, yes, I'm ready. I would like that. I would like to be taken for the making of a crop circle. And so I said, how do I arrange that? And he said, well, you have to talk to them and convince them. So he said, you won't know whom you're talking to. It's not like they're going to be, right in front of you. But just talk and be thinking about them. And so on my way to the airport that summer, 1994, for about 45 minutes at least, I was talking to the beings as I was driving along and not knowing which beings they were or what they looked like. And it didn't matter. I just said, whoever is laying down these beautiful crop circles, which I am admiring so much, please just know that I'm sincerely interested for life in these crop circles. And I would just love it if you would take me for the making of one of them. So anyway, there I was in England for a month and doing other things first with my husband, and then about 3 weeks in crop circle territory. And I realized on the last night before the last day of going out to visit fields and look for crop circles, I realized that, I don't think that's happened. I haven't been aware of anything about being taken for the making of one. And so I asked again, just very briefly, and immediately I saw, after I turned out the bedside lamp, I could see that 3 very short figures coming from the area of the window, coming toward my bed. And they looked like silhouettes because the lighting from outside the room was behind them. And as they got close to me, I found my eyes closing, and I didn't know anything consciously until the alarm clock went off hours later. But anyway, what I was consciously aware of was that next day I was with a group of people and we got on a big bus, double-decker English bus, and were riding through the countryside past a field that we had been past the night or the day before. But this time I noticed that the field had a big depression in the growing wheat out in the middle of the field. And so I thought, oh, I bet that's a crop circle because that wasn't there like that yesterday. So when the bus stopped, I ran down the stairs and out of the bus and to my friend who was driving a rental car following right behind us. And I said, I think back there, the crop circle. And so a couple of other people heard me say this and they said, can I come? And four of us drove back to that field and walked out into the field and into what was a beautiful, gorgeous crop circle. And we were the very first people to be in it. It had just happened, very fresh and sparkling, and knew how to do it. It made a little sound like when you pour milk on Rice Krispies.
No.
Yeah. And that's what the crop circle sounded like. It was just so fresh and new. So it was absolutely beautiful. 2 weeks later, after I got home again and joined with my past life therapy colleague, one of them, she regressed me to that night of seeing the little beings coming toward me in bed and then losing all consciousness. And it turned out, according to the regression, that the beings did come all the way to my bed and did take me. And in the regression, I lived through the sensation, or actually lack of physical sensation, of my going right through the wall and through the air and up into the spaceship and put into a chair, sort of a barrel-shaped chair. And there were two little guys in front of me by several feet. And they were sitting in barrel-shaped chairs because I could just see the back of their heads and their necks and their upper back and shoulders. And anyway, they apparently were piloting the ship, and it went forward for a while, maybe a minute or so, and then it stopped and tilted, and I could see through the window that they were over a wheat field, and then it made a swooshing sound, like suddenly turning on a big fire hose, that sort of sound. I don't know whether it was water or what it was, but I could hear it, couldn't see it, coming from the bottom of the craft right near where I was sitting. And it made the swooshing sound and then moved a little bit to the side, another swoosh and another, all the way around a circle. And then it went whizzing around. And I was thinking, oh, this is ironic because I'm the one who hates amusement park rides like that. But it stopped. It was just one whiz around, and then seemed to be flying in a steady direction back toward where we had come from. So I woke up. They put me back in the right room in the right bed, so that was good because I woke up there the next morning, and then that morning was when we actually drove by that very same crop circle, and so that whole encounter was wonderful. I cannot say what the name of that type of beings were. The beings that came to my room to take me were shorter, and I'm sure were a different species than the ones that I saw on the spaceship. And that's very often the case, that the ones who come and escort people are usually, it seems, different than the ones that the person has the main experience with.
I know
Yeah.
you've told me in the past, and this would be even a different form of an alien that you've had an encounter with. And I was wondering if you could share with us the story about how you met an ET in the physical in your living room, because I think that's amazing.
Whoa.
Yeah.
No. Wow.
And that was in the early 2000s. Well, so by that time, I had probably been doing maybe 13 or so years of regressing people, and more every year, to their extraterrestrial contacts. So I had really, by then, lost any fear that I had in thinking about such a thing, and I had, well, have to go back a little bit. In 1997, before this experience that I will tell you about, my car and I were taken from a major freeway in Southern California one night around midnight. And that turned out to be a very, very interesting experience in which I could just ask one question after the other of a very tall being with lots of little beings standing all around watching. And with that regression, Dolores Cannon, who's very, very well known for her work, she was the one regressing me. And being the wonderful, curious researcher that she is, she kept asking me to ask questions of the being. And after a while, after several questions, he said, she can just ask directly. She can just say the question she's wondering about, and I will answer through you, Barbara. So that's what we did for most of the session. And then at the end of the session, having given us lots of information, he said, if you have more questions at some time, just do what you did today. Just get together in the same place and just ask your questions, and I will come and answer the rest of them. So 2.5 months later, Dolores and I met in Los Angeles, and she did a second regression on me to that same experience. But this time I had a long list of questions to ask the being, and she had a long list. So we got all of those answered. And all of that information is in her book called The Custodians, Dolores Cannon's book called The Custodians. The last 2 chapters are about my experience, although she calls me Bonnie the investigator instead of Barbara the therapist, because I wasn't ready to be public about the fact that I was having these experiences too. So anyway, that all the questions and answers are in that material, that chapter that anybody can read if they want to. So then the third experience was the one that, Tara, you were asking me about.
Yes.
So I was home one particular afternoon, nobody else in the house, doors all locked, as I always do when I'm just by myself in a home. And I was walking through from my study into the living room to go to another part of the house, when I was just really surprised that there was somebody there standing in the middle of the living room. And I was even more surprised that the person standing there was a reptilian extraterrestrial being. And
Oh my gosh, I just got goosebumps again, even though I've heard this story before.
yeah, it's a good goosebump provider for sure. Anyway,
It is.
before that, I had heard a lot of things about reptilians. And I had heard that there were some that people tend to be especially afraid of because of the way they look, and some of them act very grandiose, and some of them act sort of fierce. But I had also known one of my clients whom I worked with for a lot of regressions had grown up having a friend on the spacecraft who was a reptilian male. And he was kind of like a friendly uncle to her. She always enjoyed being with him. So that probably helped my feeling about it. But anyway, as soon as I saw this being, of course, I was surprised that somebody was there and surprised that he was reptilian. But he just seemed so nice and safe and enjoyable. So I just went right over to him, and he had his hand extended for a handshake. And I just held that hand in handshake position for another 5 or 6 minutes, I would guess, that he was there. And all the while I was standing really close to him, looking at his eyes, his beautiful, round, yellow eyes that reminded me of shiny marbles, like a shiny yellow marble. And they had little vertical slits instead of round irises and pupils like we have. The vertical slits that came down and had a little jog in them, like a little lightning strike drawing. And I was fascinated with them. And I was looking in his eyes and holding his hand. With my peripheral vision, I was seeing the shape of his head and his skin texture and all the colors, a lot of different shades of green and brown around his head and his face, and more of a sienna brown on his neck that were models of greens and browns, almost like a camouflage effect, except greens and browns. And a very built man, like a gymnast. Since that experience when I've athletes performing, it seems like the gymnast build were more like his than any other kind of athlete. Anyway, beautifully muscled and toned. And he talked to me telepathically, and basically, make a long story short, he was uh, telling me that he was there to give me the experience when I was awake and alert. In the middle of the day, there was lots of sunlight coming in my big living room windows, so that I would know absolutely for sure, without any doubt, that these experiences with other beings do happen. And he also knew from wherever he is, he knew that all the time when I was working with people, doing regressions and talking with people about their experiences, that I completely trusted them and believed them. And whenever I would be away, I did a lot of world travel all those years. And when I'd be in Thailand or China or someplace, and I'd be doing something completely different, that every once in a while the thought would go through my head, gee, I wonder if all that stuff that I do back home, those regressions to extraterrestrial experiences, I wonder if they could really be real. Well, I think they are. I certainly feel convinced when I'm there. Anyway, these beings from way out there in space, I assume, or wherever they are, that they knew that about this one person, about me, that sometimes I would have that thought, that doubt. So he had been sent to me, he said, as a friendly ambassador to let me know, give me my own conscious, awake experience in the light of day, he said, so that there'd be no mistaking that this experience was real. And he said, you can feel me, you're touching me, you can feel me, through holding his hand. You can see me, you can hear my thoughts. You know that this is real, and you can take this with you forever. So suddenly, after I would guess 5 or 6 minutes or so of his being there and speaking to me, suddenly, poof, he was gone. And my hand was up here in handshake position and wasn't holding his hand anymore, and he wasn't there. He just poofed, vanished. So it was really a good experience. And every time I've thought back about that, and it was in the early 2000s that experience happened, but every time I've thought about it, I've just felt really, really good about that. And tremendous respect, even more respect than ever, that these beings who are so far away from us. Now, I don't know what that means, that they are aware of every single person on Earth, or just people who are very interested in this sort of thing or work with it like I do.
I know I've asked you some other questions about it in the past, but I am curious, and maybe you could answer this for the group, is when you said you were holding his hand, like, was it a human hand, like we have 5 digits, or was it a different shape? What was it feel like? Did they have skin like ours, or is it like more like a reptilian type skin, like a reptile, an iguana or something like that?
Well, it felt very much like a husky human man's hand, a little bit thicker from the front to the back, but it felt very much like that. And since then, there have been 2 men men here, whose hands I have shaken, that reminded me of that, in the sense that they were a little thicker. So there was a sort of a softness on the palm, a little give to it, but thicker this way. Yes, 5 fingers. And I purposely did not look down at the hand that I was holding, because if I see claws or talons, I'm really going to be
Run out
comfortable
the
with
room.
this. I'm going to freak out. Yeah. So I did look down, and I didn't look down at his feet for the same reason. So it's not that I felt webs between his fingers or anything like that. They seemed, from the feeling point of view only, since I never really looked at them, seemed like he had 5 fingers and a regular palm like we do. Now, the outer skin, which I was not touching because it was palm to palm, the outer skin would have felt different, I'm sure, because it was a different texture. It was more of a reptile type of texture. So people have asked me about the texture. It was as if there were little bumps, little bumps all over the skin, rather than the big ridge shapes that crocodiles have and alligators. It wasn't that pronounced. It was more subtle. He was a good guy.
Did he tell you what his name was?
No, he didn't, but he just said that he was one of those beings who was created to be a friendly ambassador, to
Interesting.
validate people that mostly what they do is they come to people who've been having these encounter experiences with extraterrestrials, and just to appear. He said very often one of us will stand sort of behind the person who's looking in a mirror, and will come up just until the person sees us, and then we disappear. And but a glimpse of the being when the person's awake and looking in the mirror is enough to validate for the person. In other words, many people wonder about their sanity. Gosh, I see these usual beings, and they're not like human. I don't know what they are. They're so different. And no, it must be my imagination. I must be having some sort of vision that I didn't know I could do. And they would question. And if they talk to anybody else, usually the other person doubts it and makes them think, oh, it must have been an illusion, or it must have been a flash daydream or something. So very often people do appreciate having that validation that what they thought was real, although nobody else thought so, was real.
You mentioned that he was attractive. So my question to you is, has there ever been somebody who's had a boyfriend, girlfriend with a being? Like, is that something
Yes,
that really?
on rare occasion, I know several women who, during the course of all these years, has spoken to me about having a relationship. In fact, one woman, and she's a very attractive, probably in her 40s, I would guess, uh, woman, and I'm with her in person. Anyway, she has said that she has a continual love relationship with a being. Now, the being is more of a human type of being. There are a number of species out there that we could easily think are as humans. They could pass here as humans. So she has a relationship with one of those male beings from another planet. But even though he looks mostly human, um, he said he's not able to stay here terribly long in our density and viruses and so forth. So it's been quite a challenge for them to find out a way to be together. But when I met with her, which was probably a couple of years ago now, they were really planning to have a lifelong relationship and therefore have a marriage.
You mentioned earlier that they don't always have the same emotions we do. So my first thought is I think of Spock from Star Trek, who is
Right,
dating,
right.
and he doesn't have a lot of emotions, but he does.
Right,
They're all
right.
internal.
Yeah, so male definitely, she says, has a lot of love for her. And it's not necessarily that sexual drawing together, attraction kind of love, but with a deep, abiding soul love that she had never experienced with a human man. So they realized, of course, I haven't heard from her for a couple of years, but at that point in time, he was going to come here very briefly, and they were going to have a brief ceremony, and then he would have to leave. She could leave with him. It's more feasible for her to be with him on his spaceship than it is for him to be here for very long on Earth. So they have a long distance relationship, like some people do here.
And was he a
Yeah, and
hybrid, you said?
no,
Was
he's to be more of a spiritual being than an extraterrestrial, but he was living on a spaceship with other very advanced beings of that sort.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Now, is there a story that you can share where someone may have thought they were with a human being, but it turned out it was actually an alien somehow disguising themselves as a human?
Yes, yes. Implies that there are those beings who are living here as humans, and yet they're not. You know, they're from a different species that is very human-like enough to pass here, but they live here all the time, probably. You know, they're more comfortable back there on their own spaceship. Yeah, but it is, yeah, there are several women I've worked with a bit who have had relationships, they say, with other beings like that. And then, of course, uh, it makes us wonder, it makes me wonder, um, how many of them, the other beings, are actually living here and functioning here, you know, full time. Because now and then I get reports of that a certain person really isn't from here. Usually the woman who knows them, or the man, it's usually a woman whom I've had contact with about this, they'll say, I knew things like, I knew when I first saw him that he's not from here. Or there was a man who has a friend like that who seems to be from a different planet. He said, you know, I keep thinking that this guy is not really one of us, but he can function here as one of us. Uh, they don't live together, so he doesn't see how the guy is 24/7, but every time he sees him, he's functioning as a human, but he has something so different about him. I mean, his eyes, the vibration of him is so different that the man I know who knows him is he's not here. And when he asks that man, you know, where are you from? He never gives names and places on the earth. He just said, "Oh, you know, I've kind of forgotten about that. It's a long way away." He'll say things like that. Yeah, and the man I know will say, "Well, what's the name? Are you from a different country?" So, "Oh, yeah, I'm someplace very different." But he won't say a country and he won't give a name. You know, so it's all of that sort of adds
Sounds
to
like
the
some guys I know.
Yeah, you know what? You say that in jest probably, but it could be that there are many people among us, you know, probably not particularly standing out, uh, but are just functioning, just living, all right, and they may not live exactly the way that we would choose to live, but do, and they're usually very private people, so people don't really get to know them or know details about them. They don't give forth much information.
What's the craziest story that you have for our listeners about extraterrestrials that you
Oh,
can think of?
oh, that is so hard to answer
There's probably
because
so many.
yes, there are so many. Well, one I would like to point out, I don't know if it's crazy, but there's one woman I've worked with who's been taught by various extraterrestrials about healing so that she can heal other people here. And at one point, she had a tremendous amount of energy put in the temples of her head by somebody who was standing behind her, and his fingers were coming around, sort of pressing into her temples. And the energy coming from those hands was amping up to being really, really strong. And finally, she had to say, "Oh, stop. I can't take it. It's too intense. What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I'm just giving you an extra download of energy so that, you can be more powerful in the healing work that you're doing on Earth." And then he came, after taking his hands away, he came around the side of the chair. She said she was sitting in a chair that reminded her of a barber chair, kind of a little bit reclining. And he stood there, and he had on a Hawaiian print shirt and sort of jeans that were cut off like culottes and bare feet. But she noticed the bare feet were definitely not like ours. They had webs between the toes and sort of curled talons at the end. And then she really looked at the rest of him. He was definitely a reptilian, trying, she thought, to look like a regular guy. He was a good guy. He was fully reptilian. The more she looked at him and talked with him, uh, and he was giving her all this healing energy to use for good. So I have found that you know there are many different types of reptilians, and a lot of them we would not want to meet up with. They would be very scary for us, I think. But there are some that are really decent and nice, and I think trying to help people.
We're definitely going to have you back again because you just are a wealth of
3 times.
information. Yes.
Okay.
And there's so many different topics. We haven't even scratched the surface on crop circles and all the different topics you have in the books that you've written. But in the meantime, I want to remind people where they can find you and your information. So your website is barbaralamregression.com. And people
Right.
can go there and book an appointment for a session with you. And can people do a remote session from a distance, or do they have to be with you in person?
Yes. No, more and more people are doing it remotely on Zoom or Skype or StreamYard or
Wonderful.
FaceTime. Those are the
Perfect.
ones, and they work very, very well. And it really feels like we are together. So that's nice for
Absolutely.
people to know. And therefore, I'm very privileged to work with people in a lot of different countries. We just have to figure out the time difference. Yeah, yeah. And then I'd like
Absolutely.
to mention my YouTube channel because there are probably about 20 or so interviews on various topics, some of them extraterrestrial. And so that is Barbara Lamb ET Regressions, plural. Yeah, Barbara Lamb ET
Okay.
Regressions for the YouTube channel. Interview podcasts on there. Yeah, so
Perfect.
that
Wonderful.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
we'll make sure we put all of the links in the description so people can find you. And I know that they buy your books on your website, correct?
yes, yes, with a signature and a little message to each person. Yes, they're available on Amazon, but when they're on Amazon, you don't get the signature. Yes.
That's the most
Absolutely.
important part. Yes, you have been and continue to be such an inspiration, not only to us, but to others that work in this field and for the betterment of humanity. And I just want to thank you personally, thank you for all that you've done. We really appreciate you taking the time to connect with us and all the stories and experiences you've shared. We've really enjoyed hearing about. But before we close, are there any final thoughts that you might have or any words of wisdom that you can share with us in the audience?
Well, there's a lot of interest from many, many of the species out in space, interest and caring about humanity and the Earth. And some of them are very, very concerned about what we're doing to the Earth itself and what we're doing to our fellow men. So that we have great support from many, many different types out there. And it seems to be escalating, that they want to communicate with us and warn us about what we're doing, as nuclear proliferation keeps expanding. More and more countries have nuclear weapons, and they know that they could just go off all the time. They consider Earth to be a very special planet, because not only we have life, but we have more species of life than any of the other planets in existence combined. An extraterrestrial gave me that information. And many of those species had a part in creating us human species anyway, way back, way, way, way back in time. So the, some of them consider us like their children or their great, 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 great grandchildren. They want us to be okay. They want us to survive. They want us to get our act together and treat each other better. A lot of them are much higher in consciousness and morality and spirituality than many of us humans. And they would like to see us growing in that particular way.
Wonderful. Well, I think that's a great message for everyone. Basically, just be kind, right? Be kind to one another and treat others as you would
Yes,
want to be treated, regardless of what species or what color, what size, what shape. Just be a kind person, be a kind human.
right. Absolutely.
Thank you, Barbara.
Wonderful.
Thank you
Or
so much.
So much, Barbara. We appreciate you and we appreciate your time and we wish you all the best.
okay. Many thanks to both of you and blessings.
Hi, Barbara.